is time now for our weekend cover story. And for 20 years, Kathleen Folbigg has been branded as Australia's worst female serial killer. But she has maintained her innocence, adamant that she did not kill her children, Patrick, Sarah, Laura and Caleb. In 2003, she was convicted of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. Her diary entries used as damning evidence in the trial, one of them reading, "She left with a bit of help."
So now a scientific breakthrough might prove they were words of a grieving mother, not a guilty one. Her daughters found to have a rare gene that can cause sudden death. Now, after 2 decades behind bars, she might finally walk free.
So let's bring in Professor Emma Cunliffe in Melbourne and Associate Professor Dr Bob Moles in Adelaide. Good morning to you both. Emma, we'll start with you. You first came across Kathleen's case back in 2004. When you were writing your PhD, what did you find?
That's right, Jane. So back in 2004, as I was starting my PhD, a number of mothers were being charged with killing children in England, in Canada and in Australia. I started out by studying all of them. I was interested in the medical scientific evidence that suggested that multiple infant deaths in a family was necessarily suspicious. That never had a good evidentiary basis, and over the following 2-3 years, every one of those cases in England and in Canada was reversed. The convictions were quashed. So by about 2007, Kathleen Folbigg's conviction was the only one left standing. I focused my PhD on Kathleen's case and concluded in 2009 that she'd been wrongly convicted.
Emma, I want to ask you about Kathleen, the person, because Kathleen's case featured in your 2011 book, Murder, Medicine and Motherhood, and stated that she was wrongly convicted. You wrote to Kathleen in prison to tell her about it. How did she respond?
Yeah, that's right, Clint. It was quite a moment. I completed my PhD on the basis of the court records, the transcripts and the evidence against her, and I never spoke to her or her legal team. So once the book was accepted for publication, I felt I should let her know that the world was going to hear that some academic in Canada thought she'd been wrongly convicted, and I reached out to her to ask her, was she interested in reading the book? Did she want me to do anything with my conclusions? The first letter that I received back from her was pretty devastating, to be honest, Clint. It contained the line, I've learned in here that hope can destroy as much as enliven, and I need to know if you're going to do something with this. Are you going to speak to the world about what you found? And of course my answer was yes.
It's just harrowing, isn't it?
It is. Obviously, we have to point out that we don't have a final decision in this case. We're still waiting to hear that. Bob, your work focuses on legal theory and miscarriages of justice. I mean, if the court does conclude that there is reasonable doubt here and Kathleen does walk free, what happens? Almost 20 years in jail, will she be up for compensation?
Yes, well, look, she certainly would be up for some form of compensation. The difficulty is in Australia, and particularly in New South Wales, that the procedure for getting compensation through the legal system is extremely difficult. In the case of Gordon Wood, it was established that there were very significant errors at his trial, and then subsequently, after his conviction was overturned, he did sue to try and obtain compensation for his 3 or 4 years in prison after having been wrongly convicted. And whilst the judge accepted that there had been significant errors at his trial, decided that he wasn't entitled to compensation because he couldn't establish that the prosecutor had acted with malice. And so malicious prosecution is the ground upon which you have to sue. But in the case of Henry Keogh in South Australia, after he'd been in prison for 20 years, he was offered over $2.5 million by way of an ex gratia payment, which means that the state will offer the payment without admission of liability, and he was happy to accept that. In the ACT, David Eastman had the advantage of a Human Rights Act there, and he sued for compensation after having been in prison for the similar period of time as Mr Keogh, 20 years, and he was awarded just over $7 million in compensation.
So, I mean, Bob, as Jane rightly pointed out, there are a lot of ifs at play right now, but if she is found innocent, she's lost 2 decades of her life, her 4 kids, Can any amount of money or compensation actually make up for that?
Of course not. Absolutely not. You simply can't go back and rewrite the history. And it has to be pointed out, of course, that it's not only just 2 decades in prison, which would be bad enough for anybody, but because of a particular crime that she was convicted for, that didn't go down well with the public, and it didn't go down well with the people in prison. And so for most of the 20 years that she spent in prison, she's been in solitary confinement because even the other prisoners don't want her around. And on the odd occasion, she has actually been beaten up by prisoners when they got the chance to do so. So it's been a particularly awful time for her, and that, in a sense, can't be undone. All we can do is try and offer some form of compensation to help her get the support that she needs to recover from her awful experience.
Emma, you have devoted a large portion of your life to this. You're obviously in contact with Kathleen. Do you know how she is feeling about where this case is currently?
Yes, Jane, I spoke to Kathleen briefly on Wednesday, and I certainly won't speak for her. She's had far too many people do that over the last 20 years. But what I will say is she and her team are obviously relieved that we're now at the point where it appears likely that she will be exonerated in the present commission. We're turning our minds to the future and to the supports that she'll need when she is released. As Dr. Moles has explained, she's had a difficult time in prison. She's never had the opportunity to grieve her children. She'll need a great deal of support as she transitions back to being a free woman.
Well, thank you both for your insight this morning. It's been an intriguing 20 years, and I dare say we're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the coming weeks.
Yeah, thank you both for your time.